So one of the most important media in painting is oil paint. This is probably the most popular media, the most well known, and for good reason. It was developed and adopted in the Renaissance period, and it is what it sounds like. It is oil mixed into pigment. Traditionally, linseed oil was the oil used for this. Sometimes you see other varieties today, but that is the traditional recipe. So one of the reasons that oil painting is so loved, right, by artists is the effects it can create. Primarily, this idea of luminosity and light. And I talked about with tempera, for instance, you get this opaque quality to the paint. It's a type of paint that you don't see the light kind of pass through as much, and so it creates this opaque quality or sort of flat quality. So with oil painting, you'll notice that you get this idea of luminosity. You have the wood, of course, that your canvas is attached to. Your ground is placed over that. If you're wondering what that is, usually we refer to the idea of gesso. And here you have the recipe for making gesso. If you wanted to ever make it at home, you can also buy it pre-made, of course. And it's this white paste, essentially, that becomes what we call the ground, the white plaster ground here. And then your paint layers, your oil paint layers would be placed on top. Here's a blow up right over here of the underpainting, typically actually done with tempera, which is interesting. And then your oil paints right on top and your oil varnish finishing that off, capping that off. Now you'll notice that the idea of the light, they talk about how it travels through and it kind of bounces out. And you get this luminosity to the paint. So this is the reason why oil painting became very, very famous, is the ability to have that shine or that luminosity. The white enhances it, also. People who want to have a darker painting actually sometimes used a dark ground, as we put it. They would actually create a gesso that was dark, so it would create a darkness instead of a lightness. As I mentioned, oil paint is put on top of the gesso, and this is a finished oil painting by Jan van Eyck. And the Van Eyck brothers, Jan here and also Hubert, his brother, are usually credited with creating oil paint. Now, some art historians disagree with that. Some, say yes, it definitely was them. And I'm in the camp where I believe the Van Eycks are primarily responsible for this media. So I do agree with that. And again, you'll notice there's sort of a shininess to the painting, a luminosity to the painting that you wouldn't get with other media. This is an altarpiece done by the Van Eycks as well, to again give you a sense of what oil paint would look like. A Vermeer painting, and a Van Gogh. So you're kind of traveling through some of the time periods. When we get to the time periods, you'll run back into Vermeer and Van Gogh and the Van Eycks. So with the Van Gogh, I use this example to show you the idea of impasto, and that's that thick kind of buildup of the paint. This is the same detail twice of this portion of the painting here. So notice we're zooming in on it. In art history, we call that a detail. So we're zooming in on it, and you'll notice that this thick, right, layering of the paint is what we refer to as impasto painting. So again, sort of a technical way to use oil paint in a sort of to give texture, right, to a work. So oil painting, very, very popular. Watercolor. This is pigments mixed with gum arabic. And I gave you an example of a watercolor and then also watercolor set. Watercolor, of course, it's bound by its laws of its media. So you have to be very diligent with this media if you want detail, because it's obviously going to be very runny. But also that's kind of a fun part of the media as well, because you can get this kind of shading and bleeding that can be very lovely. This is a typical watercolor here, I'd say, where you get a little bit of that shading and bleeding. But then you can look at like someone like Durer, who you've encountered before. He is a master artist. He worked in pretty much every media there was. And these are some of his watercolors. I show these to students and they don't believe me, but believe me, it's a watercolor. So it's amazing to see his control with that media. And again, another one here as well. Acrylic is the final media I wanted to mention to you. It is a pigment mixed with plastics. And this is a media that came about in the modern era, so 20th century media, and is something obviously made through science and technology, the plastics mixed with the pigment. It's made on an industrial scale. It's cheaper. It can be purchased easily in a store. It doesn't have to be made by artists. So this is a very popular media with contemporary painters.